Have you ever been in a situation where someone said something unfair about you? Something that hurt your reputation, your dignity, maybe your image in front of people you respect, and you just stood there, frozen, feeling that immense pressure rising in your chest, that inner voice screaming for you to defend yourself, to explain, to fight back, to prove them wrong. Maybe you gave in to that pressure and responded in a way you later regretted. Or perhaps you stayed silent, but out of fear, out of an inability to act, and that silence left a bitter taste, a sense of defeat, of cowardice. Modern society teaches us from an early age that those who don't speak up are weak, that letting things slide means losing. That silence in the face of provocation is a sign you have no argument, that the other person won. You grew up in an environment where the loudest voice usually got its way, where aggressiveness was mistaken for strength, where holding back your words was seen as a lack of character, and you carried that with you as a fundamental belief about how to survive in a world that doesn't forgive perceived weakness. But what if all of that is completely backward? What if the silence you were taught to interpret as surrender is, in fact, one of the most sophisticated forms of power a human being can wield? What if the person who reacts to every provocation, who always needs the last word, who feels compelled to justify themselves with every criticism, is revealing not strength, but a deep dependence on external approval, an inability to stand on their own without outside recognition? Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau, discovered something extraordinary about silence, not as an absence of response, but as the ultimate expression of a human being's inner freedom. What he found in those camps, and what he later developed over decades of clinical practice in Vienna, will completely change how you understand self-control, personal dignity, and true human strength. To understand what Frankl discovered, we first need to grasp the context in which this discovery occurred. Imagine a man who arrived at the concentration camp not just as a doctor and intellectual, but as someone who had spent years developing a new theory about human psychology. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, the Nazi guards confiscated his belongings, his papers, the manuscript of the book that represented years of intellectual work. They took his name and replaced it with a number. They destroyed all outward markers of his identity. The implicit goal of the concentration camp system was precisely this: to reduce a human being to a thing without identity, without agency, without dignity, forcing an automatic response of total submission or suicidal revolt. What the Nazis couldn't confiscate, and this Frankl recorded with clinical precision in Man's Search for Meaning, was the freedom to choose one's own attitude in the face of circumstances. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. These words are not philosophical abstraction. They were born in the most concrete and brutal place humanity produced in the 20th century. The silence Frankl practiced in those camps was not the silence of erasure or surrender. It was the silence of someone who understood that reacting impulsively to every humiliation meant handing over to the totalitarian system the last territory it couldn't occupy by force, the inner space. There were prisoners who reacted to every guard's provocation, and they were invariably destroyed more quickly, not just physically but psychologically, losing the thread of identity that kept them human. There were others who found in this capacity not to react automatically a paradoxical way to preserve their humanity. Frankl observed this with the eyes of a psychiatrist and lived it with the body of a prisoner. The conclusion he reached transformed 20th century psychology. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In this space reside our freedom and our capacity for growth. Self-control is not the suppression of emotions. It is the ability to inhabit this space, to not let external stimuli automatically determine the internal response. This understanding leads us to something contemporary culture rarely articulates adequately. We live in an era where immediate expression is celebrated as authenticity. Social media rewards instant reaction. The cancel culture moves at the speed of a tweet. Messaging groups explode with opinions formed in seconds about complex events. In this environment, the person who pauses, who absorbs what they've heard before responding, who deliberately chooses when and how they will speak, is often perceived as slow, distant, or even guilty for their own silence. The implicit logic is terrifying in its superficiality. Innocent people defend themselves immediately, therefore those who don't defend themselves are guilty. Frankl would have recognized in this dynamic precisely the mechanism he called primitive reactivity, the tendency to collapse the space between stimulus and response until the two become practically the same thing. transforming the human being into a system of conditioned responses rather than a free and responsible subject. And now I want to pause and talk to you honestly. I know many of you watching this video have experienced situations where you stayed silent in the face of something unfair and then spent days questioning if you did the right thing. If you were a coward, if the person wouldn't think you agreed with what was said. That weight of misunderstood silence is real, and it hurts in a very specific way. So tell me here in the comments, have you ever chosen to remain silent in a difficult situation and regretted it later? Or have you been at peace with that choice? Simply write, "I still don't know how to distinguish silence from weakness. Nothing more is needed," and know that by doing so, you are helping other people watching this video who carry that exact same doubt in silence, unaware that thousands of others are asking themselves the same question. When you share your experience here, you give words to what others feel but can't name. This is an act of genuine courage. Frankl developed in logotherapy, the school of psychotherapy he founded based on his discoveries, a concept he called self-distancing, which is the uniquely human capacity to separate oneself from oneself, to observe one's own internal states as an observer, and not just as a subject submerged in them. No other animal has this capacity. A dog can't critically observe its own anger. A bee can't decide to disobey instinct when that instinct is leading it astray. But a human can be angry and observe that anger can feel the urge to lash out and deliberately choose not to, not because they've suppressed the emotion, but because they've exercised what Frankl called noetic freedom, the freedom that operates in the distinctly spiritual dimension of a human being, above biological and psychological conditioning. This distinction is crucial because it resolves a paradox many people live with without being able to name it. They confuse emotional suppression with genuine self-control. Suppression is when you swallow your anger, push it down, pretend you feel nothing, and let it fester like internal poison that will eventually explode in the wrong situations or manifest as physical and psychological symptoms. The genuine self-control Frankl speaks of is something radically different. You feel the emotion fully, you acknowledge it, you name it internally, and then you consciously choose the response that will best serve what you deem meaningful in that moment. The practical difference is immense. The person who suppresses and the person who exercises genuine self-control might look identical from the outside, both quieted by provocation. But internally, they are worlds apart. The first is at war with herself, fighting to contain something she perceives as threatening and uncontrollable. The second is at peace, not because she feels nothing, but because what she feels doesn't control her. Frankl described several prisoners in Auschwitz who maintained this inner serenity even in the most degrading conditions, not because they were unfeeling or had repressed their humanity, but because they had found something the guards couldn't touch, a meaning that justified their existence even in hell. There was one man Frankl described who daily shared his last piece of bread with others, who comforted those on the verge of collapse, whose presence had an almost palpable calming effect on everyone around him. This man wasn't suppressing his pain, he felt it completely. But he had found in the act of serving others in preserving his inner dignity a meaning that transformed suffering into something bearable. This understanding touches on something popular psychology rarely articulates. Silence as a form of self-control isn't neutral. It can be the expression of complete surrender, of the self being extinguished in the face of an external force perceived as irresistible. Or it can be the highest expression of a human being's inner sovereignty, an affirmation that what happens outside has no automatic power over what happens inside. The problem is, these two forms of silence look the same from the outside, and only the person living them knows which one they are experiencing. Frankl never promised it would be easy to distinguish between them, but he precisely identified the criterion. Silence born of fear is followed by resentment, a feeling of diminished self and ceaseless rumination. Silence born of conscious choice, grounded in a higher value, is followed by what he called a sense of integrity, a coherence between what you believe and how you act, producing a unique form of peace, even when the situation is difficult and injustice remains unaddressed publicly. If these ideas resonate with you, if you feel someone is finally naming a distinction you've intuited but couldn't articulate, subscribe to this channel. Here we explore Frankl's thought and that of other humanistic philosophers weekly, offering real tools for existential questions that conventional self-help manuals can't answer. You don't have to walk this journey of self-discovery and building a life of genuine meaning alone. Click the subscribe button and join a community of people brave enough to question, to seek, and to grow through ideas tested in the most extreme circumstances human existence has ever produced. Returning to the central question, Frankl identified a pattern in his clinical practice he called compulsive reactivity, the inability to tolerate the discomfort of not responding. This inability has roots he explored in depth, often linked to what he termed the existential vacuum. When a person hasn't yet found a sufficiently strong meaning to organize their life, they tend to seek substitutes, constant approval from others, control over external perceptions of themselves, the need to always be right, to never appear weak, to always have the last word. These substitutes act as anesthetics for the inner void, but like all anesthetics, they require increasing doses and eventually stop working. The person who needs to respond to every provocation because they can't stand someone thinking something negative about them is, in Franklian analysis, revealing that their identity is entirely dependent on external sources of validation. There's nothing internally solid enough to sustain the self when the external world doesn't confirm the image they want to project. This is an existentially fragile condition, not a position of strength. The paradox Frankl illuminates is that the compulsive drive to demonstrate strength, to never appear vulnerable, to always have a ready retort, often hides and simultaneously deepens a fundamental weakness, the inability to sustain oneself without the confirmation of others. The truly strong person, in Frankl's conception, fares one who can be misunderstood, unjustly criticized, silenced by the power of others, and still maintain an intact understanding of who they are and what is meaningful in their life. This strength needs no audience, it needs no validation, it needs no last word. It exists self-sufficiently in an inner space that no external circumstance can invade without permission. There's a clinical case Frankl mentioned in various contexts throughout his work that illustrates this with disturbing clarity. A man sought Frankl out in a state of severe distress. He was a successful executive, respected in his field, with a stable family and a comfortable material life. The problem was a colleague had spread malicious rumors about him in his professional circle. The rumors were false. Frankl became convinced of this during therapy, but they had found fertile ground enough to cast a cloud of suspicion around the man. He was consumed by the need to respond, to publicly prove the accusations were false, to reclaim every inch of reputation he felt he'd lost. He spent sleepless nights rehearsing arguments. He planned confrontations. He mentally, and sometimes on paper, drafted lengthy explanations he intended to circulate among his colleagues. The more he elaborated these defense strategies, the more anxious he became, the more the problem seemed to grow in his mind until it occupied absolutely all available thinking space. Frankl didn't simply discourage the defense, he did something more sophisticated. He helped the man examine what exactly was at stake for him: his objective professional reputation, or the image others had of him, something over which he had far less control than he imagined. And more deeply, what did he know about himself that was independent of what his colleagues thought? Was there some inner core from which he could say, regardless of what these rumors stir up externally, I know who I am and what I did and didn't do? The therapeutic process revealed there wasn't. The man had built his entire identity on the mirror of external approval. His self-esteem had no foundation of its own. It was entirely reflective, existing only as long as the world around him confirmed a positive image. When that confirmation was disturbed, his entire identity collapsed. What appeared to be a reputation crisis was, in Franklian analysis, a profound existential crisis. The discovery that he had never built a self that could sustain itself without approval. The therapeutic work wasn't about how to respond to the rumors. It was about how to build a self that could exist with integrity, regardless of what others thought. And one of the central tools in this process was what Frankl called dereflection, which is the technique of redirecting attention from oneself to the world, of lessening the hyperfocus on oneself that characterizes many contemporary neuroses. The man was gradually guided to ask himself not, how do I get people to think well of me, but what can I do that is genuinely valuable in my work, in my relationships, in my field? As this redirection occurred, the urgent need to respond to the rumors lost its emotional charge, not because the external problem had been solved, it hadn't, but because it had ceased to be the primary source of meaning and identity for the man. He had found something more solid to lean on. This case illustrates something Frankl considered fundamental to understanding the psychology of self-control. The ability to remain silent in the face of injustice, to not react compulsively to every provocation, is not a technique learned in isolation. It is the natural result of having built a life with sufficient depth of meaning so that external disturbances, however real and painful, do not have the power to destroy one's center. This is why purely technical advice on how to control reactions, how to take deep breaths before responding, how to count to 10, only works superficially and temporarily. They attack the symptom without touching the cause. The cause, from a Franklian perspective, is the absence of a sufficiently solid meaning that anchors identity beyond the fluctuations of external approval and disapproval. Frankl precisely distinguished between what he called the will to meaning and what he called the will to pleasure and the will to power. Freud had proposed that the primary human motivation was the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Hadler had proposed it was the pursuit of power and superiority. Frankl agreed that these motivations exist and are real, but argued they are secondary, that they are what humans seek when they have failed to find meaning. The person who compulsively seeks power, who always needs to be above others, who cannot tolerate being questioned or corrected, who needs to have the last word in every argument. This person is, in Franklian analysis, using power as a substitute for the meaning they haven't found. And the silence they are incapable of practicing, this inability to leave a situation without a response, without control, without asserting their superiority, is precisely the symptom of an inner void that power attempts to fill without ever succeeding durably. This casts a completely different light on what we call self-control. In the popular view, self-control is a virtue practiced through sheer willpower. It's you against your impulses, reason against emotion, discipline against desire. Frankl disagreed with this formulation because it presupposes a permanent inner war that is exhausting and eventually lost. What he proposed was something more akin to a fundamental reorientation of attention and desire. When you find something sufficiently meaningful, the temptation to impulsively react to every provocation simply loses its urgency. Not because you've suppressed it, but because something more important is at stake, something that an impulsive reaction would threaten to compromise. The monk who doesn't respond to provocations isn't making a heroic effort of technical self-control. He is being faithful to something he considers more valuable than the momentary pleasure of having delivered a sharp retort. The mother who controls her reaction to a child in crisis isn't fighting herself. She is being faithful to a love she feels is more fundamental than the need to express her frustration. Frankl found confirmation of this in the most improbable stories. There were prisoners in Auschwitz who managed to maintain an inner dignity in a way that was inexplicable in the face of conditions designed to destroy it. And there were prisoners who, surrendered to despair and a vacuum of meaning, became instruments of their own tormentors, collaborating with the system for crumbs of privilege, denouncing fellow prisoners, losing the thread that connected them to the humanity they once were. The difference was not biological, not in temperament, not in social or cultural background. It was fundamentally a difference in meaning. Those who had found something to live for, a loved one whose news they awaited, an intellectual work that needed to be completed, a mission to bear witness and document what was happening so the world would know. These individuals had inner resources that others lacked. And these inner resources manifested, among other ways, in an ability not to react automatically to every humiliation, to preserve an inner space untouched by the external horror. What this means for us today, living in circumstances incomparably less extreme but equally real in their challenges, is that the development of genuine self-control does not begin with the technical work of controlling reactions. It starts with the question Frankl considered the most fundamental of all: what is worth living for? What is significant enough that I want to protect it from the contamination that comes from impulsively reacting to every provocation? When you answer that question clearly and deeply enough, a lot changes. The person who provoked you at work might still annoy you, but the irritation no longer has the same power to launch you into a reaction you'll later regret, because there's something more important at stake than proving you're right. Unfair criticism still stings, but the pain no longer demands an immediate and often rash response, because your identity now has an anchor that goes beyond what others think of you. If you're enjoying this content and feel like it's touching something real in your life, hit that like button now. Every like helps these ideas from Frankl reach more people who need to hear them, and who might never have found a way to connect with this transformative thinking. And if you know someone who struggles with this confusion between silence and weakness, who suffers from not being able to stay at peace when they don't respond to provocations, share this video with them. Sometimes an idea arriving at the right moment completely changes someone's trajectory. Frankl developed a specific technique he called paradoxical intention, which has direct application for those struggling with compulsive reactivity. The logic of the technique is counterintuitive, but psychologically sophisticated. When someone is stuck in a compulsive pattern, directly trying to stop the pattern often intensifies it, because focused attention on the problem increases its anxious charge. Paradoxical intention proposes that instead of fighting the impulse, the person deliberately and even humorously intends to do exactly what they want to avoid. In the context of reactivity, this could translate like this. Instead of fighting not to respond, the person deliberately decides to observe with curiosity every impulse to respond, to note it as an interesting phenomenon almost with scientific distance. Ah, there it is again, the impulse to defend myself. Fascinating. Let's see how it plays out. This observational distancing, which is a form of self-distancing, removes the impulse's automatic urgency without suppressing it. The impulse still appears, but now it's being observed instead of blindly obeyed. This technique only works when there's sufficient development of the noetic dimension Frankl spoke of. The specifically human capacity to observe oneself from the outside, to not be completely identified with momentary internal states. A person completely identified with their anger, with no distance between I and my anger, cannot apply paradoxical intention because there's no point of observation separate from the emotion. Developing this capacity is gradual and requires exactly the kind of existential work Frankl proposed. Building a sense of meaning strong enough that the self has its own substance beyond the emotional states that pass through it. There's a contemporary application of these ideas that deserves special attention because it's where most of us face the greatest daily challenges with reactivity. Social media. The architecture of these platforms is specifically designed to collapse the space between stimulus and response. Notifications demanding immediate attention, comments inviting instant replies, reward systems that prioritize emotional engagement over reflective engagement. Frankl never knew social media, but he accurately described the psychological mechanism they exploit. When a human being doesn't have a strong enough sense of meaning to anchor their attention and energy, they become vulnerable to any external stimulus that offers the illusion of significance through immediate reaction. Anger is particularly effective at this because it produces a sense of vitality and purpose, even if temporary and often destructive. The person who spends hours responding to provocations on social media, who feels energized by conflict, who compulsively checks for replies to their replies, is experiencing what Frankl would call a form of existential vacuum filled by substitutes. The sense of importance that comes from being responded to, from having impact, from existing on others' radar. The Franklian counterpoint to this dynamic isn't passive disengagement or digital asceticism. It's finding something significant enough that makes the need for immediate reaction less urgent. The person working on a project they consider genuinely important, cultivating relationships they deem deeply meaningful, developing an understanding of themselves and the world they find valuable. That person simply has less inner space available to be hijacked by reactivity. Not because they've disciplined themselves not to react, but because there's something more interesting and more important to invest their attention and energy in. This distinction between silence born of fear and silence born of strength and meaning is something you can start developing today, not through a grand immediate transformation, but through small practices of attention. The next time you feel the urgent impulse to respond to something, before you reply, ask yourself, does this response serve what is genuinely important to me? Or is it just serving the need for the other person or the world at large to know that I'm not what they think I am? If the answer is the latter, that's a sign the impulse comes from the vacuum, not from meaning. Not that the response is necessarily wrong, but that its urgency isn't a good guide. Urgency isn't clarity. Emotional intensity isn't wisdom. Frankl observed that the people most capable of this discernment were invariably those who had a clearer relationship with what they called their deepest values. Not abstract values, not values declared in public speeches, but the values that effectively organize everyday choices. Who do I want to be when no one is looking? How do I want the people who love me to remember me after I'm gone? What do I consider a life well lived when I look back in a moment of clarity? These questions, which seem too big for everyday life, are precisely the kind of existential anchor Frankl considered essential for humans not to be swept away by the current of every appearing stimulus. Genuine self-control, from the Franklian perspective, isn't the product of an iron will heroically fighting impulses. It's the natural result of a life that has found sufficient direction that many impulses simply lose their urgency, not because they were suppressed, but because they were outpaced by something more significant. Just like someone truly in love doesn't have to force themselves not to think about other people. There's simply something more interesting occupying the available space. Someone who has found enough meaning doesn't need to make a heroic effort to avoid reacting to every provocation. There's simply something more important to invest energy in. And here we arrive at the point that closes the circle of what we opened at the start of this conversation. We return to that scene. Someone said something unfair about you, something that damaged your reputation or your dignity. The urge to respond is real. The anger is legitimate. The injustice is objective. But now you have a different question to ask yourself, a question that Viktor Frankl discovered in the most unlikely place of the 20th century, within camps where humanity had tried to reduce human beings to mere things. Regardless of what this person thinks or says about me, who do I choose to be in this moment? Not what I feel, not what I feel like doing, but who I choose to be. This choose to be is the space Frankl found between stimulus and response. It's the space that no concentration camp could eliminate. It's the space that social media tries to collapse but cannot destroy. It's the space where the most genuinely human part of each of us resides. The silence that arises from this space is not weakness. It's the loudest affirmation of a freedom that no external circumstance can confiscate. It's proof that you are not just the sum of your reactions to what the world does to you. It's a demonstration to yourself before anyone else that there is something within you that exists beyond approval, beyond validation, beyond the need for the world to confirm who you are. Frankl lived this in Auschwitz. We don't need Auschwitz to learn the lesson, but we can learn it with less suffering and more intention through the tools he left us. If this video opened something in you, if you feel these ideas have the potential to genuinely change how you respond to the world, share it with someone else who is on this quest. Give it a like so more people can find this content, and subscribe to this channel, because this conversation doesn't end here. Each week, we explore the depths of Frankl's thought and other humanist philosophers who offer real answers to life's most fundamental questions. You deserve continuous access to ideas that honor the depth of who you are and who you can become. The journey of building a life with genuine meaning is the most important one a human being can undertake, and it never needs to be traveled in absolute solitude.